and his monitor didn't work, and he stood in front of a whiteboard and he talked for an hour and a half in absolute details. And I kind of looked at him and said, "This guy sold me. I don't know who I'm going to give the business to, but it's going to include this guy." He knows what he's doing. All right. So today, going through the business report of June, key highlights were retail slowdown, FX pressures, and rent versus 3PL, which is a lot about benchmarking. So in the retail side, if I guess you're hoping for a big increase in retail sales in the near future, you're probably going to be disappointed. Um, FX is kind of, in a way, a new way of looking at uh, FX risk. And as I said, in warehousing, looking at benchmarking. But first, let's go through. Anybody know how to get rid of that thing up in the top here? Oh, you just put the cursor over it and it moves. Okay, there it goes. So on the economic updates, I do this, and it's usually in the first part of every report. And it kind of looking at why are the economic indicators important? And they're looking at it, every company, large or small, corner stores to, I don't know, a big auto factory, is driven by economic forces at home and abroad. Local conditions set your cost base, national policies set your financing and labor environment, global markets determine your input price, whether it's finished goods or raw materials, what the competitive pressures you're going to hit, and currency risk. So whether you trade across borders or not, the economy does affect your income. Now, quickly going through, and I think for certainly this presentation, population, and we're looking at it, how it's affecting virtually everything. Canadian population was slightly down, and that was in January. Consumer price index was running at 3.2 in May, which is up from April's 2.8. But if you take a look at the footnote, is gasoline was up 33.2% versus 28 in April. So it did move, and it moved almost proportionally with gasoline. So in some ways, the gas price but only marginally flowed through to consumer prices. I think in other meetings I was sitting in, people were looking at and saying, how should we adjust prices with the cost of gasoline and so forth? But it's kind of who's going to start moving them through into the pricing. Unemployment was slightly down. Real GDP, I think, is interesting. Zero. Didn't go up, didn't go down, just sat there. Retail trade was up 0.5, and it was only up 0.9 in March. Imports were up, but 0.3. Exports were up 1.6. So all in all, there is little change, but that in itself is significant, and we need to understand that. Try and go quickly. I think you probably heard in the news a lot of people talking about technical recessions, but technical recessions, there's no definition for it. In fact, many economists have come out and said that's not even an economics term. Uh, Somebody in probably the news media made up the term. So the IMF ties a true recession to 2% GDP decline over 2 quarters. Severe downturn is close to 5. Of course, the Bank of Canada rate stayed at 2.25. Now they estimate that GDP will probably move 0.4%, and they were saying a great swing. I don't know in how many businesses you would look at 0.4% as being a big swing, but there it is. But recession scares people. Everybody becomes pessimistic, and the economy slows down. It's self-fulfilling. It's a professor from Rotman School of Management. So it's not doom and gloom. Trade surpluses widen, tariff picture stays uncertain. Of course, we all know that and watch what's happening with Kuzma. But a second consecutive monthly surplus, the largest since January 2025, driven mainly by global oil prices. Exports to the US rose 4.8%, a third straight monthly gain. Of course, led by crude oil and passenger cars and light trucks. Motor vehicles and parts were up almost 6%, and imports of electronics and so forth were up 4%. I enjoyed this comment that was made by the chair of the European Parliament Trade Commission about the tariffs and so forth. As long as decisions are important issue, as long as decisions on important issues are made only in the White House, you have to expect decisions will be made against agreements, which basically said, yeah, we'll pass the agreement, but who knows what's really going to happen. Well, what always got me, and I took a little look into it, was motor vehicles. And we've had in the news for quite a while now, auto workers complaining about the tariffs and about the industry and so forth. And when you look at it and say, hey, motor vehicles and parts exports were up 6%, what are they exactly complaining about? And what I found is Canadian auto workers aren't complaining because exports are falling. They're complaining because the industry is growing while their job security is shrinking. Here's what they see. Electric vehicles require 30 to 40% fewer labor hours. Battery jobs pay less than traditional auto assembly. Many roles are technicians, not skilled trades, and automation is extremely high. So to me also that the auto plants in Canada, particularly Oshawa, Oakville, Windsor, and Brampton, are old. And they either need to be updated and retooled to compete with some of the brand new ones being built in the US and Mexico. But that also means productivity increases, less labor requirements. So they have valid concerns. It's just not on the trade side for the moment. Now, retail trade. Most of these numbers are 2 years, and I'll do some more recent ones. But it's kind of the headline: modest growth, soft volumes, wide regional gaps. And you can look at it showing in a 2-year span that retail was up 9.1. But in 2026 so far, retail is showing up only 1.6%. And in Ontario in April, retail dropped 1%. Now, wide regional gaps is you can pick up, and also you can see here, the peak sales was in May 2025. Ontario still has the lion's share, but as I just said, they were down retail sales. So they still have the lion's share of retail sales, but the actual sales in April were down 1.6%. E-commerce share of retail 6 to 9%, but that's not moving very much. So when you look at the regional side, you pick up national is 9.1, Alberta's 13%, Nunavut. Don't know if anybody has a foot in Nunavut on retail, but it's growing dramatically. Strongest sales were motor vehicles and parts, but that in itself, auto sales are very cyclical. Now, the cycle was impacted by a number of changes, particularly COVID, where the vehicles weren't available. The weakest were at electronics and appliance retailers, and I'm surprised beer, wine, and liquor retail. But that could also be significant in a way. Now, Alberta leads with 13. Quebec and BC lags. They are less than an 8%, where the national average was 9.1. But I'm kind of looking at it and saying, why? Okay, everything seems to be flat. When looked in more specifically, and it comes on retail trade, population pull to population drag, a flattening and now declining, particularly with non-permanent resident population, is already dragging on retail sales, GDP, and overall demand growth. And it makes logic once you kind of put it together. We had very high increases in population, which naturally and is logically picks up, would affect retail sales. And demand softens immediately as there were fewer newcomers arriving and spending on essentials. The GDP, retail is a major component of GDP. So GDP is not going to grow if retail is flat or declining in some areas. Now, it may look good if you're looking the GDP per capita is growing, but that's just because it's divided by fewer people. And also construction intentions. If you're a developer and you're sitting there looking at a flat or declining population, you may hesitate from making the big developments for growth in that area. So in numbers is in 2025, students alone dropped by 125,000 and will be down to 408,000 by the end of 2026. Now that's 500,000 people. And what you're trying to draw the point to is, where are those students? And you see the decline in Ontario, and you say that's where the large universities are sitting. And we're reducing temporary residents to less than 5% of the population by 2027. It's kind of be careful what you wish for. People were saying this growth in population and in students and temporary residents was affecting the cost of housing. But cutting that out is going to affect other markets at the same time. So if you're looking at this process and it seems to be nailed down past 2027, Canada was structurally dependent on population inflows. Retail sales growth may stay low or even turn negative. Right? Not great news, but there is a clear reason for this. I'm kind of looking at the different products and so forth to adjust to a market that'll probably sit relatively flat for some time. And the first store type is general merchandise, the most population sensitive category. And we're talking about Walmart, Costco, Canadian Tire, and Dollarama. They feel it first. They're virtually a proxy for domestic demand. When domestic demand slows, these are the guys that get hit first. And you look at NPR, but non-permanent resident, they arrive with no household goods, spend immediately on essential, have high consumption intensity in the first few months, live disproportionately in urban centers where these type of stores dominate. So that also leads to the negative retail sales number, grant you only 1%, in Ontario and Toronto area. So general merchandise softening for several months, underperforming, in fact, in food and health categories. They were losing a momentum even before non-permanent resident cap was fully bid into the stats. And they are dependent on new household formation, high frequency, broad basket spending by urban newcomers. All of it points to Ontario and Toronto. Now, looking at building materials and garden dealers, you can see different areas of Canada are hit very differently. Ontario minus 8.9 over 2 years. But you're running into Alberta, Manitoba, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan with fairly healthy growth. So when you break it down across Canada, national sales fell 1.2% over 2 years, which was bucking the broader retail trend, became even more seasonal with 2.5 billion in February 2025 going up to 5.4 in May 2025, 113%. So the seasonality is extremely key in this area. Again, Ontario struggles, losing 103 million in monthly sales over those 2 years. But when you look at it, fewer newcomers, fewer new households, fewer setup purchases, weaker volumes. E-commerce, when you look at it, is e-commerce share gains versus soft volumes. Now, they continue to grow, but very slowly. So when you're looking at the growth, it's not the growth you were used to 4 or 5 years ago. it's still sitting in roughly the 7% of retail. So there's a bit of a move, but not great. Also, I looked at some of the numbers going back over the years, and the growth 3, 4 years ago was very consistent and substantial. But now we're seeing a very strong holiday seasonality, which of course all the bricks and mortar stores see, but it wasn't necessarily e-commerce. So they are getting into a stronger seasonality, particularly holiday season. And as I said, they're only slightly ahead, growth is slightly ahead of bricks and mortar. It's resilient. They continue to have reasonable growth, but not what they used to. You look at that big 40% February post-holiday drop. It's kind of hard if you think of Amazon and their infrastructure, and how do you manage something like that?
And Bob, those e-commerce figures, where are they coming from? How are they measured?
So they're a dollar value. Stats Canada.
Okay.
Canadian dollar. Let's get to foreign exchange, something I worked in for many years. And I'm just looking at a new way to manage it. And what I did in June was look at a longer period, often put in the report of, what's the exchange rate this month versus last month and so forth. So we're looking over a 2 year period. And this is looking at the different currencies. Here is Japanese yen, which this basically means the Canadian dollar appreciated against Japanese yen, New Zealand dollar, and the pesos. But I look at 7 of 10 currencies strengthen against the Canadian dollar, which isn't great. 3 weaken. But looking at managing foreign exchange is more putting it together as not saying here is the exchange rate and this is where it moved. Is it strong, weak, or volatile? And who are your trading partners and in what and their currencies? Now, the strongest was Swiss franc, but the Swiss franc is like gold. It's a safe harbor for investors. In fact, at one time, the Swiss put on a negative interest rate on deposits in Swiss dollars to try and stop people from buying, Swiss franc, because it was hitting their domestic markets. But it's more to take a look at is which currencies or which countries do you deal with that have a volatile and pricing using that knowledge uh, in a way to try and get ahead. And what you see, take care of the Mexican pesos, is building in some kind of buffer because you know that currency is volatile. It is going to move plus or minus. I did a few graphs and looked through them, and the swings can be huge. So you need to build in, and I would say in the pricing, okay, a buffer against those swings. Now, strong is one thing to look at, though we don't. Yeah, Swiss franc, kroner. by and large, Canada, and if you see in here, and this is where we do a lot of hedging, is in the US dollar. And it's really quite stable, the exchange rate, compared to other currencies. And Bank of Canada's energy surplus and Bank of Canada's consistency keeps the Canadian dollar from breaking out. A slow drift, but not blow up risk. So, in a way, is looking at your imports and the countries you import and which one should you watch, what should you hedge, and how should you price accordingly, understanding what the volatility is. And that makes a lot more sense looking at it over a longer period, such as 2 years, to say should we be working on our pricing to manage volatile currencies. And something I had in last month, which is if there is a problem in a country, we sit here and often try and deal with one problem at a time, or whatever the current problem is. And the current problem is oil prices. But many countries, particularly Mexico, have problems that are going to be there for the long term. Mm-hmm. Now, as I just mentioned, US Canadian is relatively stable. The euro, fourth strongest gainer against the Canadian, it peaked at 1.6 in October 25, up 7.5% in the past 6 months. Fairly volatile, but moving in a consistent direction, which you can manage. Mexico down 2, but it's been up and down over the last 2 years significant. Now, the renminbi in China, all-time high, but low volatility. And it's kind of a key one to look at when you're thinking about managing currency, is that it's consistently growing because the Chinese government want it to, and its trading partners complain that it's undervalued. But our settlement in renminbi is very small. We don't pay Chinese suppliers in renminbi, but it does affect the rate. And I think I've talked about this a number of times, and I'm looking at there is what I've called is cross currency. So people may say, no, I buy from China, I pay in US dollars, and I hedge in US dollars when I need to, and so forth. But in effect, you really are buying and paying in renminbi, because what you're doing is you're buying US dollars at a specific exchange rate. The seller is selling US dollars against renminbi. So it's these two rates that are combined that are affecting that. So when you're looking at managing currencies, it's not only the currency that you're buying and selling in, but it's also the country that you're buying from, because eventually the seller is going to have to get into convert to their home currency to pay their local expenses. Yeah. So there's always two sides to monitoring this risk. So warehouse space are outsourced to a 3PL. And Michael and I were talking a little bit about this before the presentation. And what I said is it's benchmarking. and why benchmark? Uh, if you're talking benchmarking and doing your homework when you're negotiating and looking at these prices, what you're trying to do is to force the conversation back to the market, not to the story of the supplier or the warehouse owner or 3PL owner. And I made some blunt statements in it is that the 3PL or the warehouse lease, they're going into labor is up, space is tight, costs are rising, and so forth. When I was working in strategic sourcing, I often started off and say, I don't care. Those are your problems. I'm hiring your management. You do it better. Okay. The problem that you're paying in labor, your labor is up, is maybe you have too many staff. Maybe you should have invested in productivity measures long ago. All right. That's not my problem. My problem is if you charge me too much, I can't compete. And if I can't compete, you lose business. And benchmarking cuts through that narrative and anchors everything in the reality. Here's the reality of the marketplace. I need these prices or I can't compete. How can you help me do that? So quickly go through warehousing costs there. I have some of them here, but they're in the report. If you have questions on them in the report, I also had an appendix showing that these numbers are a result of some, I forget right now, 10 or 11 studies that were done. They're wide ranging because of the different kinds of processes that are needed and and looking at making that decision. But the key is your costs and how you run your warehouse is not my problem. All right. So anyway, and I liked on one of the studies is had a realistic 20,000 square foot Ontario warehouse. You can look internally and look at this and try and say, okay, how does that compare against my internal costs if I own or rent a warehouse, and how does this compare against a 3PL? So basically, what it's coming down to is space, labor, equipment, technology, compliance, always there with government, and management time. So the study came out and said fully loaded annual costs would be just around $1 million. Now, in the commercial rent index, which I publish from month to month, it only comes out every 3 months, is the index moved in those 2 years 109 to 115. So what you're looking at that is about a 6% area. But industrial warehouse was strongest at 8.9, where office space was the weakest. Biggest gains were in Edmonton, Vancouver, and Toronto. The highest level was in Nova Scotia, Vancouver, and Toronto, which basically the base for commercial rent was in 2029 was 100. So in fact, Toronto is now up to 121.7.
Bob, sorry, it's Brendan. Can I just ask a
Yeah.
question here, just so I understand that properly? So are you saying then that Toronto had a 21%, or sorry, a 21% increase in rent? Is that how I understand it?
You can say percent. It's close enough
Okay.
in using the index. But yes, but that's since 2019.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
they restarted the index in 2019.
Okay.
All right.
I would
And
gladly
placed it
have
at
taken
100.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's now at 121.7.
Okay.
Pretty
Thank you.
close, 20% increase over that period.
Yeah. And that's all uh space within the industrial warehousing category. So old buildings, new buildings, short buildings, tall buildings, etc.
That's correct. They
Okay.
don't break it down from there. I don't
No.
believe they collect the data in that detail.
Yep. Thank you.
So appreciable increase.
Oh
Now,
yeah.
hmm,
Yes,
looking
for
at,
sure. That and then some. It's one of our
yeah,
biggest amount of time being spent on negotiating, which property owners generally now in our with us anyway are REITs, and so it's just a financial thing. They don't really give a hoot about what we do. Anyway, that's just part of our industry. So thank you.
hmm. Yeah, I should look at REITs. I got heavily involved in REITs down in California when the whole market blew up. And they sent a pile of us down from Toronto to going, what the hell happened? Um, and REITs are scary things when they start falling apart, when investors start moving out.
Yeah. And yeah, it's almost like it's collusion right now because things should be coming down, but they're trying to do everything not to have that happen.
Well, you sell it to an investor who sits there and wants to make 15% a year. And now the investor sees that's not happening, so he wants to sell out his ownership of it, and things start collapsing. Uh, anyway, on the 3PL benchmarking, uh, and you'll see there's, as I said, there's quite a movement, but it's more to the side as somebody comes in and says, okay, receiving pallets, we're going to charge $20 a pallet. You go, explain to me why it's not 12 or why it's not 10. What's the problem? And it's the complexity. And if there isn't complexity, uh, then say, I don't see why, it's at this rate. But if there is a saying, okay, well, how can I make it simpler for you? All right. And it's all through that process. But when you're looking at the cost buckets, receiving an inbound, storage, okay, why is storage at that level? Okay, as you can see, in the uh, 10 or so reviews we looked at it, it can move from 22 to 48, which is double, 100%. Why? Uh, and as I said at the start, they will sit down and say, oh, well, labor's up there. I don't care. Well, you know, what do you have? You have your warehouse downtown Toronto. I don't think that's a very good place to have it uh, because of the cost. Pick, pack, and order, first item, additional lines, packaging, and so forth. And here's those numbers. And I would say if you looked at those numbers, you kind of say, okay, here's the range. Where do I sit? Okay. And why do I sit at the higher rather than the lower? Uh, and ask those questions of your supplier. Shipping, the same thing. I found it strange because I hadn't run into that. But the markup is usually okay, the culprit in there. If you're dealing with a 3PL and the 3PL is managing the courier delivery costs and so forth, there can be an excessive markup of those. So it almost is a side analysis to go back in and say, now I'm being charged X, but I can sign a contract for Y. Why are you charging me so much? And there is a sizable markup if you allow the 3PL to manage the delivery costs. And of course, value-added services, kitting, relabeling, returns. Really looking at each one of these in isolation and questioning where you are. Kitting, 60 cents to 350. Yeah, maybe it's warranted. Maybe there's very complex kitting process, but do you need that? And as it says, biggest multiplier is complexity. And everybody knows that you take something and hand a mess over to somebody and ask them to straighten it out, they're going to charge you. All right. Order profiles, packaging, handling, hidden items, of course, inventory carrying costs, 20-30% value annually. And if you reflect back on what we were talking about on the retail side, is if this is going to be slow, particularly in volume, and this is volume driven. Now, as you know, it's not dollars and cents. Technical fees, administration overhead, and of course returns, which is a monster. But looking at each one of them and saying, where am I in here? Okay, am I at the high? Am I at the low? And does it make sense? I always found touring multiple facilities very productive. Probably the most productive things I ever did was you go out and you go to one company and they show you around. You go to the next company and it's like night and day. I went to a large courier company one time and I was walking along and they had this big cage and all these boxes were in there. And I go, what's that? And they said, oh, those are the products, the items we couldn't deliver. And I thought in the back of my mind, you're showing me this? Are you trying to sell me on how efficient you are? Or are you just saying, hey, we just throw them in that cage and lock them up? They didn't get the contract. And I guess the thing on there is don't buy into their inefficiency. This is hard, that's hard. Well, probably because you make it hard. I went into another one, another courier company, and I was sitting down with the president of Canada, and he had a nice office. And he had a big picture window, but the picture window looked into the sorting facility. And he looked out there and he picked up the phone. He goes, there's a package sitting by the third pillar on the left. What is it and why is it there? You kind of get a picture of these companies are very different. So warehouse rental versus 3PL. Looking at the economics and so forth, which takes into, there are so many specifics for each company and what they need. Here are the general ones is it's a 3PL is a variable cost. 83.7% of 3PL costs scale with volume, protecting you from slow periods. There's no capital investment in equipment, staff, or facilities, and they absorb seasonal peaks. And if that's your business, you rent your own space, you have more direct control over control of inventory and fulfillment process. There is a long-term cost stability if you have the volumes. And at very high volumes, your own warehouse can be cheaper per unit. So its volumes and its size. Less than 5,000 orders, 3PL, 5 to 15 hybrid or 3PL, and greater than 15,000 per month, consider renting. But those are kind of the breakdowns that came out of the studies. Uncertain growth, 3PL. Stable, predictable volumes, renting could save you 10 to 20% running your own warehouse. And what they have is at the base here is looking at 2,500 orders, 7,500 units a month. At that or below is looking at 3PL. But again, what I was looking at and saying, you go out, look at these places and so forth, but determine where you are. And what I was showing before, there was a wide range, and say, well, if you're charging me X, it must mean that, you know, that my business has a complexity that costs you more money. Tell me what that is. So, where are we? Okay, close to that. So basically, over the last hour, we've gone through economics updates, 2 soft quarters, but not a true recession. Bank of Canada is holding its rate at 2.25. Retail trade, population drag is cooling the demand. And that doesn't look that population is going to grow anytime soon. General merchandise stores feel it first. If something's happening in general merchandise and that's one of your key markets, and it starts to slow, that's probably the tip of the iceberg. Foreign exchange, the dollar holds a narrow but stable band with a small drift in it until we get CUSMA set up. But no, nothing's broken there. Renter 3PL. For the base case volume, a 3PL wins on cost flexibility and lower prices. So I guess the bottom line is conditions are soft, but they're stable. Plan for slower retail demand, a range-bound dollar, and lean variable logistics that flex with volumes. It's very hard to predict, and certainly I don't see anyone predicting a huge growth in retail sales. So, questions?
Hey Bob, thanks for that. I found it even quite interesting. But yeah, from a question, if you go back to the foreign exchange, piece of it, making an assumption that most people on the call are, running Canadian companies that are buying U.S. currency and then U.S. currency buying, an RMB, kind of currency. Are you just kind of like two questions? Like the first would be, are you seeing or hearing of instead of like Canadian company purchasing US dollars, which you mean then again get exchanged at some point in time into RMBs, is there a benefit of seeing if, like, say, for a Chinese factory, you could pay them directly in Canadian funds or just buy RMB and pay them in RMB, and to try to take out the like the variables of buying US dollars and then buying RMB, because we're finding that costs across the business have been going up for a bunch of years, but anything to kind of mitigate the risk in those variable you mean controls?
Well, actually, the settlement in RMB is growing quite quickly for Asian countries,
Hmm.
such as where you're looking at Malaysia uh, and those countries, they are actually buying more and more from China and paying them in RMB. Canada hasn't. There is a line that China has set up uh, through the Bank of Canada, though many Canadian banks haven't taken up, where they China is trying to get more companies to pay them in RMB to take out the US dollar. I don't know if that's that feasible right now, and it's more the Canadian dollar. There just isn't the market there. I worked in Asia for years, and you often couldn't get a yen Canadian exchange rate. Nevertheless, a uh, renminbi Canadian exchange rate, they would have to cross it with the US. I think one of my biggest points is to look at Canadian renminbi and what is happening in the currency. It will probably continue to increase just because that's what the Chinese government want. Okay. Also against the US dollar. Now, you can talk to your banker, and you would have to actually your banker well, is to get him to talk to the trading room. Okay. And they can get involved in that. What I was looking at is when you're dealing with, let's say, we're talking about China, when you're dealing with in US dollars and sitting back and saying, okay, I've got the US dollar and I can do anything I want, it's going to be impacted, and your prices are going to be impacted on the rate between the US dollar and the renminbi, and to
Mhm.
look for that. I did a job for a Canadian company, and I warned them that they needed to watch this, because my experience in Asia, particularly when I was sitting in Singapore, was that if a contract goes sour in a base currency, such as, let's say, Malaysia, uh, and I look at that a lot, the company manufacturing in Malaysia could go belly up, and they'll be gone. It's not that, hey, we're going to sue them because they're not following the contract. It's try and find the company. They may be down the street under another name because they're all light industries. So be very, conscientious of what the effect of that currency is on your supplier. Does that kind of answer the question?
Well, sort of, yeah. I was just looking, you mean, for possible ways to kind of mitigate, the risk on foreign exchange because, you mean, listen, you can order something today, and if you have payment terms, or by the time that order has been produced, let's call that, kind of 60 days, and then maybe some payment terms you get on top of that. So maybe say another 30 days. So what you're actually purchasing, agreeing to purchase today, say if it was $10 and, in US currency, but you're going to pay for it in 90 days, then that $10 today could be, 9.75 or 10.50. Um,
Yeah.
you mean, so it's just like ways to, because if there's three currencies involved, there's a Canadian currency, US currency, and then a Chinese currency. Um, when you're kind of going through that, it almost made sense. Like if you could, um, you mean take out one of the exchange factors, does that kind of mitigate the volatility?
Um, yes, uh, but the question is it feasible and is the market big enough? I
Well, yeah.
like if you went to your banker and said, I want a forward contract Canadian against renminbi, and you'd probably going, what?
Right.
Um, when I was working for a bank, I remember the deputy chairman, and we were opening branches in China. He goes, listen, if you can get renminbi deposits, you can open as many branches in China as you want. Uh, the problem is getting some strength in renminbi that the market is big enough, and the bank you're dealing with has a source of renminbi, and
Mm.
that's usually by having branches in the country. Um, no Canadian bank has very many of them. BMO has three. Scotia has two. I'm not sure even if TD has one or that. So I don't. You could look at if you deal with a U.S. bank. Some of them have more branches, but until you build, and I guess I'm getting more into the banking industry, until you build kind of a branch deposit gathering in the country, you really don't have much control over your currency
Mm.
exchange. But I would say watch it, okay? And call up your banker and ask him or her that question. How do I hedge against it? Um, talk to your, when you're doing setting up the buy, is ask the Chinese company of saying, would you write this contract in renminbi? And what would that cost be?
Hmm.
And if it's only 60 days, the easiest way to do it is buy the renminbi today. It may sit in account for 2 months, but
Hmm.
you know what your cost is. So,
Yeah. Okay.
Just a quick question, Bob, just on the population growth or
yeah,
decline. Are we seeing a decline, similar decline in the US and other developed countries, or do you know that?
I don't know that particularly. I think one of the points I was looking at is I don't think we actually realize the immigration and the population growth, how much that was driving retail sales, and retail sales were driving the GDP. Uh,
Yeah, I'm sure it's doing that in other countries as well. So I'm just
yeah,
curious
and
how we compare.
um, it's kind of, I think, one of England's problems, and they're going into what, their seventh prime minister, is when they pulled out of, when Brexit came across, is their population flattened out, and they're having economic problems because of that. And so people are saying, oh, we don't want all the this high immigration, and people are coming in from all over Europe and coming into England. Well, when you stop that and they leave, your markets are going to get affected. All right. And once the markets get affected, everything else is kind of like dominoes. You're going to have problems, and they do.
Yeah.
So they keep getting rid of a prime minister and saying somebody's going to come here and fix it. Good luck.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks again for attending, Bob, for all your great information. So, the next report usually comes out in the middle of the month, and we always try to schedule these for the last Friday of each month. So hopefully we'll see you on the next one, and wish you guys a great Friday and great weekend, and talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, and
Thanks,
don't
Thanks,
Bob.
Aaron.
be afraid. Send me an email if there's something you want to talk about or if there's a question, particularly for this, the webinar. Jason, your question on FX kind of puts me into a previous life and going, oh, FX. I
Yeah.
love that.
Well, yeah, we're always trying to sort out, where do you peg it at? Because, you want to build, as you mentioned in your presentation earlier, that, you need to build some sort of a buffer,
Yeah.
right? And where do you build the buffer? And then how much do you build the buffer? Because, hey, at the end of the day, you mean that buffer either saves your butt or you mean puts a little bit of gravy into the profitability of the business. But then you still want to remain competitive, especially in a market that um, isn't growing. So it's a tricky it's like an internal tug of war, really.
Yeah, it is. And but looking over the long term, as I was saying, is kind of uh, what's your most volatile? Like it's fairly easy to look at it when you're looking at something. What the euro is showing is a rather steady growth or improvement against the Canadian dollar. You can look at that and manage that. It's the volatility up and down that is going to bite you in the butt.
Yeah.
So going, hey, that's volatile. And I personally will watch the pesos because they've got more than oil prices and everything else. And Kuzma, they have other problems in there.
Yeah, we don't really like for us personally, you mean predominantly everything's coming from China, so it doesn't really impact um our purchasing.
Mm,
Because we're either buying US dollars or if we sell in US dollars, you mean it's the US dollars that are essentially buying any inventory that we support. So
mm.
You
I
buying
remember they
similar
were,
inventory levels, Jason, or with all the tariffs and stuff, or are you bringing more over? And
good question, Michael. So you mean our Canadian business, which is, certainly the lion's share. Um obviously you're always looking to run your inventory as lean as possible. In the US, just with all the tariff situation that was going on, I'm not gonna say we stopped the US business, but we certainly close to paused it. We did dump some inventory in right before the tariffs and that's like dwindled down, but we're ramping up to want to inject some more inventory um into the US. So it's kind of just depends on which piece of business, but I would say our overall inventories are lower than they historically have been.
yeah, so
mm.
you have enough warehouse space now.
Yeah, I was going to say about Mexico is there's always you have to kind of I get into numbers a little too far, and I was supposed to go down to Mexico to renegotiate some contracts, and there was a consultant they had in. They go, "You don't want to do that." And I go, "Why?" Well, with your attitude, they'll probably shoot you. Oh, okay. Do you know who runs this industry? Okay, I got it. I'm staying here.
Yeah, good idea.
Uh,
Well, that's
All
a good
right.
way to end the webinar, Bob.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Lots of you being shot, so
yeah.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah.
Good for
All
you.
right. Well, thanks again, Bob, and Michael. Hopefully, we'll bump into each other sooner or later.
Yeah, hopefully so. All right.
All right. Take
All
care,
right.
guys.
Yeah. Bye.
Yes.
Bye.
All right. So you